Call the meeting to order. Roll call, please.
Mr. Montplaisir, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Costin,
Here.
Ms. Johnson,
Here.
Ms. McCall,
Here.
Mr. Jacobson,
You here?
Mr. Hendrickson,
Here.
Mr. Steen,
Here.
Mr. Gehrig, Mr. Redlinger,
Here.
Dr. Mahoney, Mr. Grinberg.
Move to approve.
Motion to approve. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Any questions on the motion or the minutes? All those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Is Mr. Grinberg, are you on the line?
No,
Oh, okay. I was gonna.
I don't think so.
He is now. He is now. All right. Welcome, Tony.
Hey, Rick. Hello, everyone. Martin, Mary, and Rocky are here.
All right.
It's cutting out.
Yeah. Approval of the bills. The bills you have in front of you. Kent, any comments on the bills at all?
There's quite a bit of detail attached in the spreadsheet from the Castrant Water District. There's a lot of very small bills and just a variety of others on that, but so I don't really have any comments other than you might want to look at the detail.
Okay. Total bills received would be $244,667.80. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Motion, is there a second?
Second.
And a second. Any discussion on the motion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Montplaisir,
Yes.
Mr. Costin,
Yes.
Ms. Johnson,
Yes.
Ms. McCall,
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson,
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson,
Yes.
Mr. Steen,
Yes.
Mr. Redlinger,
Yes.
Mr. Grinberg.
Aye.
Okay, motion passes. On to number 4 on the agenda, financial report. Kent?
Sure. On page 13, just to recap the totals for the year, since we're at the end of the year, 2018, $37,892,409 expended on the project, and a cumulative project life-to-date total of $453,733,022. With regard to the next page, page 14, we do have significant cash and liquidity available at the present time, about $84,833,649. And as a point of reference, too, we do have $50 million worth of unborrowed capacity on our line of credit with Wells Fargo. I just wanted to report we did meet today with the Wells Fargo people and had a very good discussion about the project and the path forward. So I just wanted to add that since it happened today. And then with regard to the other reports, or the standard reports that are in here, including the bills listing and the ever-famous cumulative vendor payment list, which has all of the vendor detail for the entire project by vendor. I didn't have any specific comments on this month's report.
All right. Any questions for Kent on the financial report as presented from anybody? All right, I know we don't really take a motion on this, but I always like just to accept the report. So if there's a motion to accept the report.
I would move to receive and file the report, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I have a motion. Is there a second?
Second, if I could do that.
You can do that. Motion and a second. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Next item on the agenda, number 5, PMC report. And in Martin's absence, I believe Kim is going to walk us through the report.
So on page 28, the overall program status, we are reporting against the $2.2 billion budget, but starting next month at the February meeting, we'll start reporting against a $2.75 billion program budget. Actual cost to date on the program, about $453 million. Remaining program budget, again, against the $2.2 billion is the $1.76 billion. If we go over to page 32, the fiscal year 2018 cash budget, the cash budget of $82 million, fiscal year 2018 paid to date is about 37.9 million, which leaves a remaining fiscal year budget of about $44.6 million.
Anything else on the budget report? Anything else, Kim? Any questions for Kim on the information from our PMC?
Just glad that the two reports now sync.
Yep. Thank you. I just have a question, Kim. I know this may not be in your court, I know it's probably in our court actually, but anticipation of when we might now complete the annual budget, has there been any discussion amongst staff or PMCs when we might get that done?
I can start this one, and Commissioner Grinberg, certainly defer to you. There's been some internal discussion about trying to realign the budget after the first quarter, and so as we get into February and March, the idea is to come back, have the full stand-up budget, and this is really related to your professional services as well. There's an extension for our current program management task order as well, providing for some additional funding through April, and then coming back and revisiting that as well. So I think that there's a variety of work that we have in front of us, but we've laid out a calendar for the next 90 days, really it's in the next 60 days, to get things put together, and that will be coming to the Finance Committee and the Board here yet this spring, late winter, early spring. So we're going to have a good plan for the balance of this year.
Okay. Any further discussion or questions? Hearing none, if you get a motion to receive and file would be great.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying yes or A.
Yes.
Yes. Opposed, same sign. Number 6, recommended contracting actions. Kim, are you walking us through these?
Yes, the first three,
Okay,
and then
well-
I'll turn it over to John Shockley.
Okay, the first 3, can we go these one at a time and just take a vote on each one as we go through it?
Sure.
Okay, there's 6 of them, it's gonna get kind of messy if we don't otherwise, so.
Yeah,
Great,
yeah,
thank
yeah.
you.
Sure. So these are contracting actions for approval. Task Order 4, Amendment 3 for Property Acquisition Services by HMG. This is a reduction. It is to extend the period of performance to October of 2020, but it's to reduce the budget by $177,000.
Okay. Any discussion or questions or a motion? To accept Task Order Amendment 3. Is
Move to approve.
there a second?
Second.
Second, any discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Yes.
Mr. Costin?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. McCall?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Aye.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Mr. Redlinger?
Yes.
Mr. Grinberg?
Aye.
Move on to 6B.
All right. 6B, I just want to make sure I have the same order. Yes. It's Task Order 2, Amendment 2, again, Property Acquisition Services, Alteg Engineers. Extend the period of performance and reduce the budget. We're reducing scope, reduce the budget by $30,000.
Any questions or a motion?
Move to approve.
Second.
Motion is second. Any discussion on the motion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Yes.
Mr. Costin?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. McCall?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Aye.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Mr. Redlinger?
Yes.
Mr. Grinberg?
Aye.
You. C.
All right. C is Task Order 2, Amendment Number 1, again, Property Acquisition Services, a contract with ProSource Technologies. This is to increase the budget by $656,000. I'm adding project management, right-of-way services budget, and bio-geo services scope and budget.
Any questions? From a layman's perspective, could somebody explain to us what bio-geo services means?
Thank you, Kent.
It sounds highly technical, but I suspect it's not.
Go ahead, Eric. Eric can cover that.
Glad somebody asked. BioGeo stands for biotic and geomorphic. It's basically environmental testing that is required because of the federal nature and NEPA compliance with the federal project. So this involves going out to certain properties along the rivers and tributary rivers and drainage ways, establishing a baseline of what the biotic and geomorphic conditions are, basically, you know, how many snails are there, how many, you know, different types of bugs are there and living in the mud, and where's the condition of erosion and those sorts of things. We establish a baseline now, and then over the years to come, keep monitoring that, monitoring the number of bugs and the erosion and those types of things to determine if the project is changing the course of nature in any way or form. And so that we need to get easements on those properties, and so we have land agents out there meeting with property owners, getting the easements to allow us access to those sites to do the testing.
Ken?
Thank you, that was a good explanation. I had a follow-up question with regard to that. As I look through page 41, 46, 47, anything that's related to this biogeomorphic services, I just wanted to confirm that we're parsing that up, it appears, and handing 3 different chunks out to HMG, Alteg, and ProSource. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes, that's correct. We have 3 different land firms, Alteg, ProSource, and HMG. We'll get into this a little bit later in the meeting, but there's roughly 1,200 some parcels of land that we need to get property rights to, and so we're divvying those land rights, those needs up to 3 different land firms, you know, sort of to manage their scope. In some regards, each one of those firms might have a previous relationship with the new property owners, and so there's, you know, a variety of factors that go into you know, which firm gets assigned to which property owner, for example.
Okay, so then as a follow-up to that question, with regard to the pricing, the one HMG is $1,570 a parcel, LTAG is $1,090 per parcel, and ProSource is about $720 per parcel, and they're all about 100 parcels. And so can you explain the rationale for the significant difference in the pricing paid for those services?
I don't know if Dean has anything to add. I don't know the specifics of that, unfortunately, today, but I will tell you that the different parcels require different land rights, and not every parcel is the same. And so depending on the complexity of what land rights we need, depending on relationship with property owners, for example, I think the land firms all take that into account. We do review all of their proposals, and you know, we have a little bit of a push and tug back and forth on their fee estimates. The specifics of this one, I don't know if Dean's going to help provide any more clarity, but I guess generally I would say not every parcel is the same, and so it's probably a little bit tricky to do an apples-to-apples comparison.
For the, this is Dean Vetter with AE2S. For the BioGeo services that we requested a bid for, or an estimate for them to complete those, we don't know exactly, like Eric mentioned, what each parcel is going to require as far as the amount of time the land agent is going to need to work with that particular person. So we suggested that they utilize about a 15-hour estimate per parcel that they're involved with. Now, some of those parcels are multiple parcels that are owned by one entity, so they will be able to cover the ground with regard to all the parcels with that particular landowner. So that reflects in some of the variation of what you'll see in the prices. And these are just estimates, so all of these costs for their services all need to be ran through our system, and we verify the services. So it's simply just a budget for them to start off with, and we verify all the expenses against those particular services.
So then the allocation to the 3 different parties is a function of critical mass of work to be done as opposed to pricing? Because we got pricing all over the board for the same service with different types of parcels. It seems like the service should be more closely aligned in pricing, and I understand this is just an estimate, but if you got one that's at $700 and the other one's at $1,500 and they just handed in their estimate, I wondered at what level of scrutiny that was given.
Well, some of the land, one of the land firms might have put a more senior right-of-way agent, the cost associated with their hourly rate versus some of the other ones might have done a lesser.
Kent, you raised, you raised some good questions. Would you prefer to do something other than approve this at this point in time, get some additional answers or information?
No, I'm fine with it, but as you look at this as a review process of this committee, if there's something we don't understand, we should be asking these questions. And I think the answer is reasonable. If it's an estimate, they're going to bill us whatever the time spent is. It's just a function of pricing then, but then that leads to disparity in pricing. So it's obvious that probably one firm can't do all the work.
Yep.
So I totally get it. But I just want to raise that attention to those differences.
Good questions. Any follow-up questions with regard to 6C? Further questions or motion?
Move to approve.
We have a motion to approve. That's for under 6C. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
And a second. Any questions on the motion? Hearing none, roll call, please.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Yes.
Mr. Costin?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. McCall?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Yes.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Mr. Redlinger?
Yes.
Mr. Grinberg?
Aye.
Motion passes. And John has taken the stand to walk us through the next task order.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be 6D and intro to 6E, and then I'm going to hand that off to Eric for a little bit. So under 6D, we're requesting a extension to task order number 2, which is the current task order with the PMC. You'll recall last year we entered into a stand-down task order with the PMC for a lighter load of activities associated with the project due to the injunction. At this time, we're working through some issues that a group of members of this board and the diversion board are on their way to Bismarck as one of those issues, along with some of the other issues relating to funding. And therefore, in its current form, we're just recommending an extension to the existing task order to give us some time to recalibrate what the budget should be, moving in a stand-up budget, and then also to recalibrate what functions of the PMC will be needed by the diversion authority as we move into hopefully a period of full construction and project implementation. So this is a simple task order amendment to task order number 2. The total cost is $1,750,000, and we're changing the date of service to terminate from January 31st of 2019 to April 30th of 2019, and adding a minor clarification to one of the tasks. And once again, this would terminate on April 30th of 2019 in order to give us some more time to better develop the PMC task order moving forward. And I can certainly answer any questions. This has been reviewed by both co-executive directors, myself, and I think it's ready to move forward to this board. So,
Any questions for John? Or comments by Mike, one of our co-executive directors? You want to comment on this at all?
I would just add, in addition to what John said, I think that we've got the sufficient amount of time to be able to really right-size our operation, right-size our program management team for the balance of 2019. We knew that it was going to take some time after the permit was issued to do just that, so we think that this buys us that time to do that. And look forward to coming back and briefing the board both on and the committee, both on the stand-up budget as well as the program management task order. So I think we're in good shape. I think we've had some very good conversations and have really appreciated the program manager's assistance and cooperation over the last couple of years during the stand-down period. And we know it's been challenging, but we're looking forward to getting ramped back up.
Any questions for John or Mike? Or a motion to approve task order 2, amendment 2?
Motion to approve.
Motion, is there a second?
Second.
And a second. Any questions on the motion? Hearing none, roll call, please.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Yes.
Mr. Costin?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. McCall?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Yes.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Mr. Redlinger?
Yes.
Mr. Grinberg?
Aye.
All right, moving on to 6C, our last recommended contracting action, and John, you're going to walk us through this as well?
Yeah, I'm going to start off the presentation, and then Eric will take over to go over an overview of the land acquisition process. And just to set the table for Eric, this is a significant task order for the Diversion Authority. This will set in motion the completion of the land acquisition for the entire project. The land acquisition as a budget line item is about $500 million, and this task order would implement the acquisition of the property necessary for the project. This is a critical path issue, and that's why it's coming before you in January. From a timing perspective, I would see that this task order is before the Finance Committee and the Diversion Board in January. We'd envision in March or April the PMC task order coming before this board, and then the Diversion Authority, and then finally the P3 procurement task order coming before. And that's a function of a very linear process in which we achieve a permit, we resolve the funding issue, and we resolve the litigation matter. And so that's why we're taking this in very linear action. The acquisition of the property will help to mitigate some of the Diversion Authority's risks with respect to contracting, in that we'll have the property in hand, and we can continue to acquire the property irregardless of the time which the contracts are bid. I would note for just public information, some of the items that are going to be contemplated in the task order, and Eric will discuss more fully, will include public outreach, which we've heard from several boards and several people that we need to be engaging in public outreach to landowners that will be impacted by the project. So that will be included within the task order, and Eric will discuss that more fully. And then this is a long-term task order. This is an 8-year task order. Keep in mind, though, the task order language does include that it is not in conflict with the master service agreement with CH2M, now Jacobs, and the subconsultant AE2S, in that if the board were to terminate the MSA, the task order would also terminate. So I'm going to have Eric jump in and provide an overview of the land acquisition process. As we're developing this task order, some questions arose. Well, what is the function of the different boards? How does the land get acquired? And I would note that Eric's going to go through what's occurring on the North Dakota side, but the process that will be utilized in Minnesota to acquire the property will be very similar, with some nuances that are due to Minnesota law. And just a brief update, as was discussed at the Land Management Committee meeting, the Minnesota entities are in the process of forming a joint powers entity to acquire property in Minnesota. They recently had a meeting to discuss what the formation of that entity would look like, and we have been drafting an agreement. And recently they sent a letter, I believe it was just today, to Buffalo Red asking if they would like to have a board member or two on that entity to help with the negotiations. And so we'll continue to provide updates on the status of that Minnesota acquiring entity. And Eric's going to walk through the acquisition process, and then I'll come back and discuss with you the task order specifics.
Thanks, John. So I have a presentation here that I'd like to walk through. As John noted, as we were developing the task order and reviewing it with staff and a few board members, there's a handful of questions that were asked that I think I just gave a similar presentation to the Land Committee, so hopefully the same information comes out here. But there's a variety of questions that were asked by certain people that, you know, as those of us working on this day by day sort of take a variety of things for granted, but whether there's, you know, new committee members or people that aren't as up to speed or in the details of how we're doing property acquisition. There were some good questions asked that really made us think about how we should probably put together a little presentation to explain what is the process that we're using, what's the structure that we're using, who's doing what to buy land. And so that's the intention of what I wanted to talk through here. I did hand out this org chart, so hopefully you have this in front of you. I realize some of the font is a little bit small, but the org chart shown is general representation of how things are structured for the entire diversion authority. On the top side, you see the members of the diversion authority and how many people are from each organization that filled the 13-person board. And then on the right side, you see the standing committees, finance, land, and public outreach. On the left-hand side, you see the federal partner and the Corps of Engineers, as well as our state agencies, the State Water Commission, and the DNR. And then on the bottom side of this graphic, you see various blocks of different consultant groups. Starting on the left, land acquisition, there's a technical consultant in HMG, the program management consultant, there's a group of firms that are helping provide P3 management and administration, and then the legal group on the far right side. The next slide in the slide deck here highlights which components of this org chart are related to the lands program. And so you see some ugly orange colored circles and squares up on the graphic here. The Cass County Joint Board takes a lead role in the land acquisition program, especially on the North Dakota side. So the Cass County Joint Board has one seat on the Diversion Authority. They are responsible for buying land in North Dakota. They've also been responsible for establishing the Special Assessment District. On the land side, they've been asked to fill that role in part because they have statutory powers granted by the North Dakota Century Code covering the entire geography of the project on the North Dakota side. If you move to the right there, the next orange box highlights the city of Moorhead and Clay County. And those two entities, as it was noted, are working to form a joint powers authority that would have the role and responsibility for buying the land rights in Minnesota. And as we've also heard here, that group has asked the Buffalo Red if they would be interested in participating in that JPA. The Land Management Committee plays a pretty key role in helping define some policies on land acquisition program. In the bottom left corner of this graphic, you see the land acquisition block of consultants highlighted. And this is a block that includes a variety of different consultants as well as individuals, from appraisers to land agents and negotiators. Those are people that are out meeting with property owners at the kitchen table, as well as relocation specialists, and I'll get into those things in a little bit more detail. Under the PMC, or Program Management Consultant block, right in the middle of the bottom side of the graphic, the highlight is on property acquisition and mitigation management. That's really the bulk of what is part of Task Order 4, which is in front of you. And then on the far right side, Onstad Twitchell is providing the legal services associated with the lands program, including drafting of purchase agreements, helping with the closing process. If we have to use eminent domain or condemnation actions, the Onstad group is helping with that. So next graphic here is a different org chart, but really focused more on the Cass County Joint Water Resource District. As noted, they have the role of acquiring property rights in North Dakota, and so the Cass County Joint Water Resource District takes that role real seriously. They obviously work with Onstad Twitchell on a regular basis. Onstad Twitchell is also providing legal services related to the diversion and working with the Joint Board. The PMC group, that's the Jacobs A2S team. We are contracted to the Diversion Authority, but provide taking direction and input from the Cass County Joint Board on a regular basis, specifically related to the property acquisition program. Shortly after receiving the permit from the DNR, right after Christmas, we issued an RFP for appraisal services, and so that is out on the street right now. It's been advertising for a couple weeks. That appraisal RFP is due February 6th. We've already been in contact with a number of appraisal services firms, and really the goal there is to have a stable of qualified appraisers under contract to the Joint Board so that we can authorize work on an expedient basis. Each one of those appraisal firms will then have a master services agreement, and then we'll be divvying out tasks as necessary to do the appraisal work. And so that appraisal block is contracted directly to the Joint Board. Also contracted directly to the Joint Board are the 3 land firms. Those 3 are HMG, ProSource, and Alteg. And within each of these land firms is a series of land agents. Again, these are folks that are out at people's kitchen tables, in their shops, talking with property owners, as well as relocation specialists. As part of the federal project, one of the requirements is to relocate displaced people. And so if we have to buy out a home that's impacted by the property, we not only need to buy the home, we also need to find replacement housing for that individual. And so the relocation specialists get involved in the eaches of those decisions. From a process standpoint, the next graphic up here talks a little bit, what are the steps in this linear process to buy land? And it all starts with design. So the designers of the project, whether that's the P3 team, the indicative design that HMG Group and the Diversion Authority have established, whether that's by the Corps of Engineers, the design dictates where the impacts are and which property rights are needed. Once we know that, we have a land acquisition directive that gets brought forward to this committee. In fact, there's a couple on your agenda shortly after this. Those land acquisition directives identify which property rights are needed, identifies a budget associated with those property rights, and then if approved by the Finance Committee, is the directive to the Cass County Joint Board to go ahead and start the acquisition process. As John and others have noted, we expect there'll be a similar process once the Minnesota acquiring entity is stood up. And it's basically kind of a get out of jail card, so if Dan decides he wants to go buy something other than what is on the land acquisition directive, you guys can string him up and tell him he bought something he wasn't authorized to buy. Not that Dan would do that. After that LAD is approved, and many times this happens before that, we have contact with the property owner. This is where the land agents really get deeply involved, trying to develop some type of relationship with the impacted property owners, meeting at their kitchen table, visiting with them, understanding, who lives there, do they have a renter, all of those types of things. Getting access to complete a boundary survey. So in many cases, we need to complete a boundary survey for the project. That boundary survey is needed by the appraiser. And so the appraiser comes out, does his work to value the property. Once that appraisal is drafted, it gets reviewed. We have a team of appraisal reviewers. And then that reviewed appraisal gets approved by the joint board. And then an offer of just compensation is made to the property owner. And so that offer is based on the appraised amount, and that really starts the process of negotiations. Again, the land agents are responsible for taking that offer, presenting it to the property owner, and then trying to develop the most equitable and fair agreement that we can for both sides. And so land agents have a lot of responsibility on their back, and this negotiation is ongoing. As part of the negotiation, again, as I mentioned, some of the property owners, maybe it's a residential property owner or a business property owner, they're being displaced by the project. We have a responsibility to find relocation, provide relocation benefits as well as reestablishment benefits. So these could be things such as moving costs, such as finding potential sites, hooking up new water service, a variety of those types of things that are associated with relocation benefits. Ultimately, then that all gets funneled into a purchase agreement, and then the closing is completed on that project or on that property. And so who decides if the deal is fair or not, as I felt like was probably another question. And so the next graphic really gets into a little bit of explanation about how we've structured the team to handle these decisions. And we know that there's some decisions that are made relatively easy. We have an appraisal, and there might be some minor negotiations from that appraised amount, pretty straightforward, really not too many questions to ask. In other situations, we get into real tricky situations where the counter offer is made, and it's maybe more than we think is appropriate or fair, but we don't necessarily want to go to court, and so somebody needs to make a decision on, well, do we go to court, or do we counter offer, or do we accept the counter offer? And so this 5-layer structure has been established where we have a lands coordination team that meets every 2 weeks before the Cass County Joint Board meetings, and all of the sort of proposed deals get brought forward to that land coordination team. Again, in most cases, they're relatively straightforward. don't require a whole lot of extra scrutiny, but in the event that they do, it gets kicked up a level. We have an administrative advisory team, and so this is Mr. Redlinger, Mr. Wilson, a variety of other staff get involved. And generally, this group doesn't necessarily make decisions, but they can help decide if it needs to be kicked to the board or some type of policy type suggestion. We've also established a strategic negotiating team. This was established to help make those tricky decisions. This group is the chair of the Land Committee, the chair of the Finance Committee, as well as the chair of the Cass County Joint Board. Prior to the injunction, this group had met just a small handful of times and had the responsibility of trying to move things along on the acquisition process. The Land Management Committee is really focused on policy, and then the Cass County Joint Board really has that sort of ultimate say. They're the ones that are signing the purchase agreements. Generally speaking, our goal has been to make these decisions at the lowest level possible. We have roughly 1,200 or 1,200 plus properties that we need to buy property rights on, and that's an awful lot of property rights. And so the goal would be to streamline the decision making, make those decisions at as low of level as possible, kick them up a level or 2 levels as necessary, but again, generally at that lowest level possible. And then on a routine basis, we would report out the progress, how many properties have we acquired, what's the status of each property, do that reporting to the Finance Committee, the Land Committee, as well as the Diversion Board of Authority. This map here shows a general acquisition status report, so this has been kind of a cover map that we would use in each one of those monthly reports. The color coding on here indicates the status of each acquisition. So green is good. Green means we've acquired the property. Blue means it's in negotiation. There's a couple purples up here on the north end. Those are where we have a purchase agreement signed, but we're waiting to, for the final closing. And so this is just a sample of how we intend to report on progress. Along with that map, we have some sort of box diagrams to show progress as well. So this is just an example. So this is representing the number of properties that we need for the project. This is some old graphics from the previous project, but for illustration purposes, I thought it maybe helped. And so this is a sample of what we would be reporting on a monthly basis. Some of you might remember these graphics from before. In terms of the lands program, and John mentioned this as well, we feel that it is a critical path item. We've been encouraged by the Governor's Task Force, by the DNR permit, by Buffalo Red, by other groups, by a handful of property owners, that it really would be helpful for us to get out and do more acquisition, talk to more impacted property owners, really have a robust outreach program related to that. And it's all a critical path item because we need to have the lands in place before we can start construction. Seems pretty obvious, but there's a bunch of land to acquire, and as John noted earlier, the P3 teams have reportedly indicated that if we could have all of the lands acquired before they're authorized, that would likely lead to some cost savings on their bids. From a standpoint of what is the scope of the property rights program, of course there's the diversion channel, southern embankment, upstream mitigation area, a variety of these environmental mitigation sites like the biogeo sites we just talked about a few minutes ago. Again, over 1,200 parcels, estimated at about $500 million worth of land rights needed for the project, and expected to be 6 to 8 years worth of effort to secure all of those land rights. I will tell you, and we felt this was important to share, that of that $500 million, that is part of the overall program estimate of 2.75. Of course, we've made some good progress to date, but there's a tremendous amount of work yet to be done. It's also interesting to note that we've spent close to $180 million on lands. We do own some asset lands that the property owner asked us to buy that are beyond what is technically needed for the project. And so we have those as an asset. At some point that asset could be used for trading, or else we'll put it up for auction and public sale and sell those asset lands. So that's I guess most people generally think that buying land in the Red River Valley is a good situation. You want to have more of it. As a public entity, it's not something we intend to keep long-term, but when a property owner has asked us to buy more land, it's part of that fair, friendly, flexible position that the Joint Board has encouraged. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to John to carry through the rest of the task order.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to cover briefly the task order, which is included within your packet, and some of the key outcomes of task order 4 will be the first quarter of 2019, as Eric noted, that we're going to undertake some early outreach to all impacted property owners. We're intending to start that as soon as possible. It is something that we've heard from most everybody involved, from the governor's task force to DNR to Buffalo Red to all, that there's a general consensus that we need to get out and have outreach with the impacted property owners. The second due out is the acquisition of property rights necessary to build and operate the project. You may recall that we put a hold on the acquisition of property rights during the term of the injunction, mostly due to the request of DNR that we not acquire property during the environmental review process. The DNR did not want the acquisition of property to prejudice the environmental review process, and so that was put on hold. And so during that time, we really hadn't been engaging in outreach or property acquisition. Now that the DNR has issued its permit, we can proceed with land acquisition necessary to build and operate the project. This is a long-term task. It could take 6 to 8 years. The total cost estimate for the lands, as Eric noted, was $500 million. The task order also includes management of impacted property mitigation, including the development of the flowage easement valuation that is ongoing, with what is the estimated value to be given to property owners when we acquire flowage easements. That's currently under development, and I believe the first phase of that report has been finished. And also ag mitigation. As Eric noted, this is I think all of us involved in this view this as a critical path for the project. Irregardless of when the contracts are issued, we will need the land for the project. I can say in regards specifically to the P3, what we've heard from the 3 teams that have been shortlisted is that there is a significant amount of value to be earned back to the Diversion Authority if we are able to have all of the property for the channel acquired and in our name prior to giving them the notice to construct the project. And there's really a number of reasons for that. Number one, it mitigates their risk against weather and flooding. So if one portion of the project channel is under flood concerns or is inundated with water, they can move their construction equipment to another portion of the project, or they can commence construction in multiple areas along the right-of-way, such as building all the bridges at the same time. And so there's some real cost savings that they can realize through having access to all the property on the day that we give them notice to proceed with construction. Also, on the diversion side of the transaction, it is a great way for the Diversion Authority to mitigate its risks. If you have the property in hand before you award the contract, there's not a danger that the contractor will be ready to proceed and you have to put the contract on hold because you don't have the necessary property rights. And really that goes for all segments of the project, in that having the land in hand prior to bidding is a clear way to mitigate any risks of unexpected project costs. The necessary project rights that are going to be acquired through this task order are the diversion channel. I just briefly touched upon that. The southern embankment, the upstream mitigation area, and I think that for public information purposes, with the change that came out of the governor's task force and was submitted as part of Plan B, that resulted in the increase of 37 feet being flowed through town, the actual operation of the staging area is likely to only occur once every 20 years. And so I think that's a really important fact so that the public is aware of that the operation frequency will be reduced due to additional flows through town, and also the period in which the property is inundated would be during the snow melt and likely to be 7 to 9 days, and probably in most areas, unless it's a major flood, not that severe. The total acquisition is approximately 1,200 parcels. I think Eric briefly had provided a chart that showed about 150 of those parcels had been acquired. The total budget line for this task is $500 million. That is not what is being paid out to the project consultant. If you go to page 79 of your packet, you'll see the estimated budgeted amount for each year of the task order. Please keep in mind these are estimated amounts, so you may have years which an item increases or decreases depending upon the pace at which property is acquired. We may have a couple years where there's a lot of voluntary acquisitions, and so we may see some of that budgeted amount move between the years depending upon how successful we are at acquiring property. I can certainly answer any questions about the task order. It has been reviewed by the co-executive directors. I reviewed it, and I believe some of the leadership of the Diversion Authority has also reviewed it, and we're ready to present it to this committee and would be looking for a recommendation for approval. The Lands Committee recommended approval of it earlier today.
Thank you, John and Eric. As John indicated, there was a number of groups that looked at this, including a small group of the Finance Committee, had a separate meeting with a number of the individuals, and there's a few changes, little tweaks here and there to the agreement, and I know our co-executive director spent a lot of time on this with PMC, and but at this point in time, if you have any questions for John or Eric, now would be the time to ask. Ken?
I did have two questions. As I read through all of these, scope of work, monitor, coordinate, manage, report, organize, assemble, do this, do that. It sounds like a tremendous effort, and a tremendous effort in coordination. So my question is a little bit more system-related. What system of integration do you have to manage this process and integrate with your land acquisition specialist so that you can cleanly store, retrieve, manage, organize, and coordinate as you're tasked to do in an efficient manner? And then is there any integration of those systems in an automated form with the ACONEX system that we use for the overall project management?
Great question. You'll see in the task order some language about certain software packages. One of them is called WMX. It's an Esri product that we've sort of adapted, built specifically to this project. And so this WMX stands for Workflow Manager. It's basically because it's Esri based, that's a GIS product. So it spatially recognizes how all the parcels are related, has certain workflow assigned to each parcel, and so that workflow that you saw up here a few slides back is built into the WMX system, and as each step is proceeded, you trigger that in the WMX system. It sends notifications out to the right people. It also serves as a repository for all the documents, so with all the letters and correspondence that go out to the property owner, the purchase agreements, the rights of entry, the survey document, the closing papers, the final deed that guarantees we have the property rights, all of that stuff is loaded up in the WMX system. And so it's really been a robust tool. Of course, it requires some tweaking around things as we move forward and get smarter and smarter on things, but that's a really good tool that's been stood up for this project, for this purpose. In terms of the integration with ACONEX, ACONEX is the system used for managing invoicing, and so all the land firms are funneling their invoice processes through the ACONEX system. We have some ongoing conversations with the brain trust behind ACONEX and the brain trust behind the WMX system of how to better integrate those. There are some efficiencies that can be gained, but they really serve two distinct purposes, and so I think we'll try to build that efficiency where we can, but we're probably also not going to spend 500 hours trying to get a pen to work in space when a pencil will work.
So then the land people will use, everybody as a team will use this system seamlessly?
Yeah, so the Corps of Engineers, all three of the land agent firms, our team, Onsted Twitchell. In fact, the WMX data is housed on the servers at the City of Fargo, and so all of that data resides within the GIS brain server system here, and everybody can get password to it. And if any of you are interested, we'd be happy to give you a tutorial and give you access to all the nuts and bolts.
Okay, and then my second question was with regard to the land acquisition process and relocation of those farmsteads that you talked about early in your presentation. Are they under the same set of rules as the Oxbow project with the housing of last resort, or are they a different federal standard? Explain to us how you compensate those people.
So the key distinction for Oxbow, when the decision was made to consider Oxbow under this housing of last resort, the key distinction was that it was a city, rural, sort of city away from a metro area, and those property owners that were displaced within the city could not find comparable housing within Oxbow. And so, right or wrong, I guess that was the decision that was made to get us into the situation where we were rebuilding homes in Oxbow. As we look at the other displaced people by the project, whether they're impacted by the channel or the southern embankment or in the staging area, generally speaking, those property owners will not be within a small city surrounded by floodwaters. And so they will be rural residential property where we can't replace the mature trees and the scenic vistas looking over the river and all those things. But the Uniform Relocation Act does require us to replace the structure and similar kind. And generally speaking, if it's just a rural residential property, that doesn't trigger us into the replacement or the housing of last resort situation where we have to rebuild homes. And so while it is consistent, there's probably some deviations to that where we don't anticipate being in a situation where we would have to rebuild homes for displaced people, but we will have to find replacement options for people, and if they choose it, they can. It really sets an allowance for those displaced people, and so if we do their appraisal and their property appraises for 100, and we look around and we find that there's 3 or 4 different sample properties that are comparable, and maybe the most comparable one is for sale for 120, then they get the 100 for the property that they own. They're also eligible for the 20 of comparable housing as a reimbursement event. So they have to spend it to get it. So that's generally how the relocation benefits work for replacement housing.
Good. Any other questions for Eric or John? It's a big task order. I know a lot of time has been spent on it. And 6 to 8 years, hoping it's 6, not 8. But is there a motion?
Yes, so move.
Motion to approve task order 4. Is there a second?
Second.
And a second. Any questions on the motion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Yes.
Mr. Costin?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. McCall?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Yes.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Mr. Redlinger?
Yes.
Mr. Grinberg?
Aye.
Motion passes. Next item on the agenda, MetroCog cost share agreement, and I do not know who's taking this. If anybody, if not, Mike, I was going to point to you.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm happy to, I don't see Jason Benson in the crowd, but there's a memo in your packet on page 83 from Jason Benson. This is a cost share agreement with MetroCog to update the recreational plan. The recreational plan was last touched in 2012. And actually, this will be programmed into the COG budget and plan for 2 years. Actually, in 2019, about $40,000 of share that the DA will have in 19, and then $75,000 in 2020, for a total of $115,000. So this is a cost share agreement with COG. It takes them several years to program some of their dollars and funds. I think I'll just make a comment. I know this came up, and I know there's some, I think some different perspectives about whether to proceed with this work at this time or not, but I do think that one of the comments that was made, and I know Commissioner Sherling passed this along, was that outreach is a component of this study, both to Horace and West Fargo, some of the other properties and communities around the area. So it is an activity that, if not now, at some point, does need to get refreshed and done. So it's been about 7 years since we last touched the rec plan. But the memo provided by Mr. Benson provides, just, I think, a good summary of some of the outreach activities, and leave it at that. If there's any questions, I don't know if COG is also present.
I'm just going to add to
good,
this.
yeah.
There was a question at land that was got a response back to. In the budget, I believe, this is the information I got, there's about $6 million appropriated in the P3 budget for the recreational construction portion of the project, and John even talked to that.
Yeah, that's correct. That's approximate. I don't have the exact numbers with me, but there's approximately $6 million that's been put in as a line item in the P3 component of the project for recreation. I think as originally envisioned, the recreation included a trail and just some basic functions. And maybe 2 picnic grounds and a couple bathrooms. It was nothing, it was bare bones recreational. The trail, I think the trail was the majority of the cost. If there is changes that are proposed to that after the P3 contract is let, there would be significant changes costs that could impact that operations and maintenance agreement. So to the extent that any decisions are made with regards to the channel, if we could get those prior to finalization of the P3 documents and concurrence from the board that is the direction that the Diversion Authority wants to go with rec, that would be beneficial, because it could be more costly to add them in after the P3 contract is awarded. You certainly have spaces that are not within the P3 that you could change later for recreational, such as the southern embankment. I think people refer to it as the camel hump now in the storage area. Certainly could be subject to recreational opportunities. But I would just caution on the P3 side that to the extent there are changes that will need to be made, the sooner that we're made aware of those and there's concurrence around what those changes should be, will be more cost effective.
And I would just add, too, to John's comment, it will also identify perhaps grant opportunities. I think the important point here is this really is just study work. This does not fund projects. There need to be some grant opportunities that the authority looks at over the long term, and this certainly will help us frame that. But, again, I know there's a question about timing, but, I think this is something that, if not now, we will need to do this in the future. So it's really to the direction of the Finance Committee and the board, but it's back before this committee at the request of the board in December. It was tabled from the board and remanded back to Finance Committee.
Thanks, Mike.
Mr. Chairman, this is Tony. This is Tony.
Go ahead, Tony.
I appreciate the discussion, and I was the one that was a little concerned and pushing back on this. My main question is, what do we have in a budget for any type of recreational additions? And as Rick and you and I talked earlier, we know that number is $6 million. And so that was fundamentally my concern, is there a budget line for this? And then two, we worked countless hours to get Plan B at $2.75 billion, and we've done enough studies. And so my sense was, we're not adding to the project anymore. We need to draw the line. But having said, what I've learned, and particularly the $6 million answer, is, whatever this report study recommends, if it adds, you pick a number, somebody's going to figure out how to pay for that. And that's grants, if that's other political subdivisions, how robust do we want that? I'm fine with that, but the budget line is $6 million.
Thank you, Tony. Any further?
So if you're,
Go ahead.
well, I've moved for approval if that's acceptable through the phone. And
Acceptable to me. Is there a second?
Second.
So we're recommending approval to the board of this agreement. Any further discussion on the motion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Yes.
Mr. Costin?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. McCall?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Yes.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Mr. Redlinger?
Yes.
Mr. Grinberg?
aye.
Motion passes. Last item, I think, actually business, a couple of land acquisition directives. Eric, you going to walk us through that?
Yeah, I know we're getting short on time here, so I'll try to be quick. There are 2 land acquisition directives in your packet. One of them is related to a number of what we've generally called opportunistic acquisitions. These are properties that most of these property owners have reached out and asked for us to start the acquisition process earlier than we would normally approach the property owners, and so hence the term opportunistic. These are property owners that, want to move on with things for a variety of reasons. You'll see some mapping in your packet that shows the location of these. The majority are in North Dakota, but it is important to point out a few of these are in Minnesota, and currently the land acquisition directive goes from the Finance Committee to the Cass County Joint Board. Once the Minnesota entity is stood up and established, then we would expect the land acquisition directive would be funneling the directive to the Minnesota acquiring entity. Until that time frame, the Cass County Joint Board is willing to continue in that role as long as it's a voluntary acquisition. In most of these cases, when people are reaching out asking to move things along, it falls into that voluntary category. The second land acquisition directive in the packet is for the remaining parcels under the diversion channel. If you recall, we had split the channel into 3 phases. We have already approved land acquisition directives for phase 1 and 2, and this is the land acquisition directive for phase 3, which is generally south of 94 down to the Horace area where the Cheyenne River crosses the channel.
Thank you. Any questions for Eric? And looking for a motion to approve both land acquisition directives at this time.
So moved.
Motion, is there a second?
Second.
And a second. Any discussion on the motion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Yes.
Mr. Costin?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. McCall?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Yes.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Mr. Redlinger?
Yes.
Mr. Grimberg?
Aye.
Motion passes. Any other business? Next meeting, February 27th, at a different location, I'm assuming?
Yes.
All right, be at the new city hall. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
We are adjourned.